Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Got a Hall of Famer this week on the show, Mike DeCourcy of the Sporting News, and you see him often on the Big Ten Network throughout the college basketball season, is back on Podcast on the Brink. How you doing today, Mike?
I am doing great, Alec. It's great to be back with you.
So obviously there's been a lot of positive news this offseason for Indiana in terms of the transfer portal and getting a commitment from Bryson Tucker, getting Mackenzie Mbako and Malik Renew to return to school next season. Just what are your overall thoughts thus far on the offseason that Indiana has put together, and just a general outlook in your eyes of what kind of team? Obviously, they've got some roster spots to fill still, but what kind of team could Mike Woodson be able to put on the floor next year?
Well, I think he has a chance to have an extraordinarily talented team, a physical team. I look at Omar Ballo as just an absolute force along the baseline, and has been for 3 years now. He is aggressive. He is powerful at both ends of the floor. He is not a great offensive player, but he also is not someone that you can't throw the basketball to and expect the offense to continue. And there were players in the Big Ten, not necessarily at IU this past year, but there were players in the Big Ten who got regular minutes that was a problem. Big men who you threw the ball to and you didn't know if your offense was over. And I don't mean he was going to dunk it. I mean he was going to lose it. Omar is someone, like I said, not an elite. He's not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar down there, but he is going to get the basketball, and he's either going to score one-on-one or he's going to continue the offense, and that's important. I like the guards that they brought in. Miles Rice had a terrific year for Washington State, was really an important part of a team that changed the definition of Washington State basketball, the 21st century definition of Washington State basketball. It had been really down for a long time, and he was a huge part of why they were able to get into the NCAA tournament. That he and Kanan Carlisle, a nice addition, dynamic, a guy who can play both positions, but probably will play primarily for IU off the basketball. And both of them have the ability to develop into capable three-point shooters. When you shoot in the low 30s early in your career, that doesn't mean you're going to shoot low 30s for the rest of time. It means that there's potential there. So two things have to happen. One, the player has to get in the gym and either just get shots up, or if there are, and I can't say for sure with either player, I'd have to watch more. But if there are form issues, then they have to get in there with somebody that can correct the form issues. But if you're in the low 30s, there's potential. And in Kanan's case, he was 32 of 100. So there's a significant number of attempts there, not a overwhelming, but it's a good sample size. So you know that he's capable. And you also know that he's been part of a team that wasn't very successful, and often the numbers get dragged down because of that. So I think that's promising. I don't think that that's the answer to IU's shooting issues over the last season or two. I think there still needs to be another addition. I'm not saying they need to have 5 more, 3 more, 2 more, but there needs to be one. Luke Goody, who's out in the transfer portal now, would be an example of, and I use him primarily because I know he's out there, and also because having worked at BTN for the last 15 years, but covered his games for the last few, I know his game, and I know that he would fit that need if he were so inclined. That's the kind of player that IU would really benefit from having. Someone who is, look, every shooter is streaky. Steph Curry is streaky. His hot streaks are longer than most. But so Luke's going to have a day where he doesn't make every shot. That happens. But he shot 39. I believe his number was 39 this year. And that's in a reserve role. But also what you have to remember is he was on a very successful team. So when the ball came to him, he needed to make that shot. If he did not make that shot, he probably wasn't hanging in the game much longer. They most nights they were only going to stick with him for however long he was making shots because they had other players who were better at other things than him. So if this wasn't his night, he wasn't going to play. So there was pressure on him to make shots, and he delivered more often than not. So I think that he would be an example of a guy that would really help IU. There may be other similar examples of players who would fill that need. But going into next year with Mbako back, with the new guards, with Balo, with Malik, you have everything covered that you need with the exception of that element.
And Baco is a guy I think maybe getting a little bit overlooked by some people. If you look at what he did in Big Ten play, I think he was close to 38% on three. So he may be able to provide some of that floor spacing. And I really thought, and I'm just curious from your opinion, watching him early in the season and the expectations that some people had on him, a guy decommits from Duke and you think, well, this is a surefire one and done player. He even talked about it media day. He wanted to be a one and done. The first couple of months of the season, he was unplayable at times because of defensive issues. Didn't necessarily look all that comfortable offensively either. But I thought later in the year, if you would have told me early January that he was going to kind of catch Owen Freeman in some of the Big Ten Freshman of the Year race, I would have told you were crazy. But he did get there in one of the votes by the end of the year. And I think he's a guy that, while he may not come in and next season and average 17 or 18 points, he can be a solid 13, 14 points per game scorer on a higher efficiency, shooting number maybe than we saw this year because of the pieces that are going to be around him and maybe not as much pressure on him to succeed. Do you agree with that? And is he a guy that you feel like could have a breakout year next year as a sophomore?
Yeah, I 100% agree, Alex. And that's why I talked about that in regards to Miles and Kanan. Mackenzie's overall number was 32-7 from three this year on 153 attempts. So again, he showed that he has the potential to be a significant three-point shooter. And that is not unusual. I mean, the absolute best guys like a JJ Redick or somebody like that, they're going to come in and they're going to shoot high 30s immediately because that's what they are. And JJ made a living in the NBA for more than a decade because of that. Just because, really, not much just because of that. So I don't worry a lot when someone comes in and shoots low 30s. I expect that number to go up because I expect, and one of the things you mentioned about Mackenzie talking at Media Day about wanting to be a one and done, I have no problem with that. But what I really respect is when someone has the year that Mackenzie had and said, okay, that's not me. I'm two and done or whatever, and comes back and says, I'm not just throwing my career onto the rocks and whatever happens because I have to be a one and done. And look, I think some of that now is the changes in the game and they're for the better, but we don't know. I mean, 10 years ago, there were lots of guys who did it just basically because they had to save face because that was the thing. They said they were going to be, so they were going to be. And PJ Washington at Kentucky was someone who stepped out of that line and it paid off big for him. So I respect Mackenzie. And so I expect that work that I talked about earlier with the two guards, I fully expect that he will be one who will get in the gym. And I can say that I think there are things he can do with his shot. I think he's got a lot of movement in it that can be compacted because he's so powerful. I think that he can tighten his motion and he will become better if he does. So I think that's and the nature of Mike's experience. I mean, he's seen hundreds of guys go through the NBA in his time as a player and a coach who developed from good enough to be in the NBA to good, to someone who was significantly making shots in big games. So I think he can help Mackenzie continue to develop as a three-point shooter. I do agree that there's a good chance that he will step forward to being in a conversation for all league, second team, first team, whatever. The question will be because you bring in Umar, because you bring in two significant guards, and because Malik comes back as well. I think the question is, where's the role definition? Like, where do you want the ball to go? How do you want to score points? Those things are all things that they're going to have to establish in the preseason. And sometimes that changes over the course of the year, but usually by the time you get to those first few games, one of the things, I don't remember what coach told me this, but players figure out the roles. They go into practice and they start to understand, okay, we're better with this, and we're better when the ball goes through him than it is than it is when it goes through me. Even if I want to be that guy, we're better that way, and I will benefit from that, because if the ball goes through him, eventually it'll get to me, and I may not be the leading scorer, but I'll be a significant scorer on a significant team. So that'll all work itself out over the course of the summer and the first couple of months of the fall. And by November, they should have an idea of where they want the ball to go. I would be surprised if McKenzie is not high on that list.
What do you think of the fit between Renew and Ballo playing together? There's been a lot of, obviously, talk about Indiana's dependency on post play, and I think a lot of the fan base would like to see more 3-pointers attempted. But last year, you look at the roster logically, and you say Khalil Ware and Malik Renew are probably your two best players, so the ball is obviously going to be going to those two a lot. Before it was Trace Jackson Davis, and this year with the portal, I don't think it made a ton of sense to try to throw Malik Renew at the 5 and roll with a smaller lineup, because I don't know that Malik Renew is enough of a rim protector or a rebounder to survive as a 5 night in and night out in the Big Ten. Plus, you look at his foul issues. He had a lot of games where he either fouled out or was in foul trouble. So I don't necessarily think that was the solution. I'm just curious, it seemed like Ware and Renew had some good synergy together at times last year, playing off of each other. What do you think it's going to look like between Renew and Ballo, and can they play off of each other effectively?
Yeah, I don't think that the traditional power forward is dead in college basketball. I really don't. Does it help to be someone who can both rebound at a high level and go out to the perimeter to make a shot? Sure. But I hesitate on this particular podcast to mention the team that played in the national championship game with a 7'4", almost totally post and pick and roll based center, alongside for more than 20 minutes a game, a power forward who scored nearly all of his points in the low post. So I don't, and that team won 30 plus games and played in the biggest game of the year. So I don't think that player can't exist in college basketball anymore. I think you have to design for it. And I am totally on board with the idea that IU needs to be able to space its offense better, certainly better than last year. I think they absolutely need to do that. But I think that the additions that have already come will already have started that process. The offense will be spaced better just by what has already agreed to come in. And then if they add that one more shooter, then at that point you will have all the space that you need, even if you play the traditional power forward who rebounds and scores down low when he gets it, or because you invert the offense a little bit. And there's nothing that says that Malik can't continue to develop his game as well. I obviously wants to play professionally in today's game. He's got to find a way to at least stretch it a little bit, as we've seen with Trace. I mean, last time I looked, Trace did not take a 3-point shot as a NBA rookie. How's he doing? How did he do? I mean, he had a terrific year, and people are really excited about him. So you can be that player without necessarily having a 20-foot shot or a 23-foot shot in the case of the NBA. You can still be an effective player, but it would be very helpful for your future if you at least became a 15-foot shooter. And that's something that Malik has to continue to work on. But as it stands now, I don't think that that's a problem. I really don't. As long as I think that Malik's defense, now that's something that we'll see, is there's no excuse for fouling out of games now when you've got Umar behind you. There's just not. You have got to play defense with your feet and not your hands. You've got one of the best shot blockers in college basketball behind you. You're no longer, although Khalil was able to block shots, he was not a force along the baseline. Players were not averse to taking it in there because of the traffic. They only had to negotiate where he was and finish properly relative to where he was. So Umar, you don't get that. You're not going to have the room. So Malik has to make sure that he's not playing defense with his hands. And that's something that, again, he has to work on now that he knows what's behind him.
With the transfer portal, we were talking a little bit before I hit record. The interest in college basketball doesn't end now when the national championship game ends. It extends, I think, in a lot of cases, maybe not as much in Indiana because they're getting closer to fill out their roster, but at programs like Kentucky and Louisville, Michigan that have turned over their rosters completely almost with coaching changes. We're going to be seeing this go on until maybe in late May, early June before rosters are finalized. I know there's a lot of problems with transfer portal and NIL and maybe getting all this settled to have a system that everybody can agree on. And as we all know, things evolve and change over time and get better. That's the goal of anything you do in life, is to make it better. But overall, do you think this has made a positive impact on the sport of college basketball in terms of interest and people being more engaged with their teams and programs on a year-round basis?
I really do. I wrote about this a year ago when we heard people get bothered by things that change. They don't like change. They want every year to be 1991, and that was a wonderful time in college basketball. But it wasn't as wonderful necessarily for the players as this time is. When you have players who are literally making 6 and possibly 7-figure incomes, it certainly wasn't as wonderful a time then as it is now. I think that there have been multiple elements of the name, image, and likeness / transfer portal era, if we want to call it that have been positive. The income coming to the players that is long overdue would be one. The conversation and the news reporting and the place in the news that college basketball occupies in the spring that it didn't over the past several years. It basically, other than coaching changes, and usually most of those were finished around at least by mid-April. You didn't have much conversation about college basketball until we got to July. A little bit relative to the NBA draft, who would go, who would stay. But most of it didn't come back around until July, when you'd go out and the recruiting circuit was active. So now that continues through the spring. The recruiting circuit is not probably as foremost as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's still out there. And then you get into the fall. So you take a little step back, but that's okay because college football's there. And then when practice starts, you start to play games, etc. So it's not a fully year-round sport, but it's a much more engaged sport. And then the other element of this that's often overlooked is what we talked about before with Mackenzie, is that players who routinely would have said, I'm here for a year, I'm supposed to be one and done, I go, or more often, I'm here for 2 years, 3 years, and I haven't made it. I've made cost of attendance money, okay, and I've gotten free college, and I'm getting trained, okay, but I'm not really making any real money, and my career as an athlete is finite. So if I want to make some money at this, I got to take my swing. And usually that swing was a miss because they weren't ready. That's why they weren't going to be drafted. So they often wound up in lesser leagues than they might have around the world or the NBA, and they made less money than they might have. So now they make money on the front end, and then they can stay longer. And then when they do go, they're as fully ready for whatever the best league they're capable of playing in is there. And so they probably, in a lot of cases, are making more money on the professional side. as NBA players or overseas, wherever, than they might have because they just felt like I have to make some money playing this game before my talent runs out. So I think there are multiple elements of this that are positive. I look at this period as really, Alex, this is probably as good as it's ever going to be for the athlete, because when it becomes employer-employee, they will lose a lot of the power, the individual power that they have now. When it becomes employer-employee and there's a collective bargaining agreement and all that kind of stuff and contracts and such, and it'll probably happen at some point. I don't know exactly when. At that point, you lose a lot of the power you have. Right now, every spring, every successful and some not that successful college men's basketball players have a lot of weight, and they throw it around. And whether it's to stay or to go, it usually ends up in them making more money. The successful ones. Now, there are unsuccessful ones who enter the transfer portal for whatever reason, and sometimes it's because I went to the high major level and I just, I'm not going to get any run up here, so let's go to the Mid-American Conference or the Southland Conference or whatever and actually get on the floor and see what it's like to play. That's great. But that's gone on forever. So I think that this concept is really a sweet spot for the athlete. And if I were an athlete, I wouldn't be in any hurry to change this system. I wouldn't. There are a lot out there that are like the athletes at Dartmouth and at USC that got involved in these suits. I don't think they're going to change it for the better for them. It may be better for the fan who then has some concept of who's going to be on their team from year to year. But it's a pretty good spot for the athlete right now to have that much individual power.
Yeah, I thought Richard Pitino, I don't know what it was, a couple weeks ago, had a pretty funny tweet, something along the lines of, I don't know how many days it was, but I only have X number of days that still have to be nice to my players. So he was referring to the transfer portal closing. He has to be nice to his players until it closes, and then he can go back to being himself, which is, kind of speaks to exactly what you're talking about. I thought that was pretty clever. To kind of expand a little bit on what you were just saying, what do you think ultimately is going to have to happen and to maybe change the system? Is it going to be the schools coming together and saying this isn't a sustainable system? We know the NCAA has never been proactive on this issue, and it's kind of, we've gotten to this point because it's the market has kind of dictated that we're going to have to make changes or things are going to be taken to court and all that. So what ultimately has to happen maybe to change the system? Because as you said, I agree with you. If I'm an elite college basketball player, I don't want anything to change. I can kind of assess my value every year on the market. It's kind of like, having a job. You can see what you're worth on the market, and if this is the best place for me, I stay here. If I can get a better deal somewhere else, I go somewhere else.
Exactly. I think that what will change it, I don't think congressional action is forthcoming, although that's the only way that you could have, that is the only way that you would have design change, so to speak. Where you within the realm of what college athletics has been to this point, where you aren't necessarily employer-employee, but the players are making money, the players are still student athletes, et cetera, et cetera. I think what will ultimately change it are these NLRB reactions, the rulings that they've come up with, like the Dartmouth case. Like what's going on relative to USC now. I think it's going to be more along those lines where they are, whether it's the courts or the NLRB that declares them employees. And I think that's where it's going to get really messy there, because what constitutes an employee then? Like, okay, so if I sell tickets to a game and I have players, does that mean it's a business? Well, high schools sell tickets to games. Even some little leagues or pony leagues sell tickets to games. So I don't know what that will be. It becomes really complicated at that point. D3, I mean, again, you're doing a lot of the same things. My nephew, who's a D3 football coach now, a defensive coordinator, and was a D3 college football player, did a lot of the same stuff that the player at USC does or at Texas does. He didn't do it as well. He's well aware of that. And he didn't have 80 to 100,000 people in the stands. And they didn't make a lot of money at what they did. But he did a lot. He had a lot of same obligations, etc. I don't think obligations necessarily make you an employee. I think that'll be the tricky part. Do you have to make X number of dollars, or is it any dollars? I think that's one of the reasons why I've always been averse to the rules. Like the Dartmouth ruling was one of the most amazing things to me, because Alex, and you'll appreciate this as someone who grew up in this state, in the state of Indiana. The Dartmouth basketball team, as of the time they were ruled to be employees by the NLRB, were averaging, I believe the exact number was 632 fans per home game. And how many high schools in the state of Indiana crush 632? All of them? Most of them?
There might be some middle school games in New Albany that are drawing more than that.
Exactly. So that's kind of why I have my questions about the where that line is drawn, if in regards to who is an employee and who is not. And I think it gets really messy when you say that a basketball team that is almost never, if ever, on television and draws 632 fans a game, they're employees. Well, then who isn't? Literally, who isn't? So I don't know where it will end up. I think at some point inside the next 5 years, they'll come to a point where enough people will have ruled them to be employees that it'll probably end up being an employer-employee relationship at the level we're talking about, for sure. I like I said, I'm not 100% on that timeline, but I try to use 5 years because it seems reasonable.
Last thing, I don't want to get you out of here. Hopefully it doesn't take too long to discuss this, but you had one of my favorite pieces of content earlier this spring when you put out your coaching list of candidates for the Kentucky job. And I remember the day you put that out there, and I think I quote tweeted and said, here's this list for Mike. And I remember that day going down in the comments and everyone kind of giving their disparaging remarks at you. I don't know how you are. I don't read the comments on my stuff on X, but I like to go on a piece like that and read kind of what the reaction was, because obviously being down here in Louisville and Kentucky, both opening this offseason, had some interest in following both of those searches. And lo and behold, Mike DeCourcy's list was actually pretty accurate. I kind of want to tie this maybe together a little bit with Indiana, though, because obviously there was talk this season with Mike Woodson maybe, being on the hot seat. Obviously, he comes back for a third season, which I thought he earned the right to come, our fourth season, come back and coach for another year. And obviously, it's turned out pretty well so far. But what do the Kentucky and Louisville job searches and maybe who they ended up with tell us about these elite jobs in college basketball moving forward, and maybe how, a guy like Scott Drew would have been unthinkable, 10 or 15 years ago, that he would stay at Baylor and not jump to Kentucky. But it seems like a lot of these guys can go somewhere else now, maybe not be in that same fishbowl type of situation, and win and build their program without the pressure that some of these elite jobs bring.
Yeah, I think, first of all, even before you mentioned Scott, but even before we had the NIL portal contagion and what that's done to college basketball, Scott built a team that was going to be a number one seed in 2020 until we had no tournament, and then won the national championship in 21. Now, there were transfers involved, but it was also high school guys. So it was a program that he was able to build at Baylor in what was the old order of college basketball. So I think that showed there. And I think Billy Donovan's work at Florida also showed that a lot of the traditional comments about where you needed to be in order to be successful in college basketball had changed. I think that football money even then changed it. I remember writing that I thought that Rick Barnes at certain periods in time had the greatest job in college basketball because you could get involved with just about any recruit in the country, and you could get a lot of them. I mean, he got Kevin Durant, he got LaMarcus Aldridge, they had Daniel Gibson and TJ Ford, and people are like, yeah, but you're not the number one guy on campus. And I'm like, yeah, that's good because you're paid more or less like the number one guy on campus, or certainly close enough that for you to live a great life. And you don't have everybody telling you what to run, who to recruit, how to play, all that stuff. People at Texas in those days would show up for a big game and they'd want the Longhorns to have more points. But they weren't saying, geez, why didn't they double that post? I mean, they just wasn't who they are. So I thought there were advantages to that even then. And now you come forward, and now the money that, especially in the SEC and the Big Ten, the money advantages that you have over everybody in terms of your athletic departments. So that means that you have a great situation if you're Nate Oates at Alabama. You don't need to be at a name brand basketball first school in order to be successful. You just got done coaching the number one seed in the entire tournament in 23 and a Final Four team in 24. When others were saying that Nate Oates, they should go after Nate Oates, I was saying, why would Nate Oates want to move? I just got done moving Alex from Fishers, Indiana, which I and we loved, to Pittsburgh. And I can tell you that moving is a pain in the butt. And even if you're Nate Oates and someone's putting all your stuff in boxes and taking it all out of boxes for you, it's still got to be a pain. So I felt immediately that they would be looking at someone that was basically next level down. That's what nearly every high major job in the last 10 years or so has either been a diversion from the path, like BYU or IU going to the NBA, Michigan when they went after Juwan Howard, or if you stay in the college basketball sphere, you're looking next level down. In the case of the Big East, it is not next level down competitively, but economically for them, it is. There aren't very many coaches in the Big East. There are a few. Ed Cooley now making $5 million a year, or at that ballpark, but there aren't many in the Big East that are doing that. So their coaches are somewhat vulnerable. But other than that, it's American, it's Mid-American, it's Sun Belt, it might be in the case of a Kentucky. Again, next level down for them. Kentucky can pay whatever. I mean, they pay John almost $9, so they're going to outpay more than likely what BYU did, and therefore Kentucky can go to the Big 12 and get Mark Pope. But they're not going to get someone who has been in the Final Four, who has won a national championship, because, as I said at the time with Scott, I said that trophy on your desk is 5 years of nobody even being able to ask you where the bathroom is. Like, they can't ask any questions. You got that trophy. And if you got two like Danny Hurley, that's ever. They can't ask you where the bathroom is. So that's why I suspected that they would end up in the neighborhood that they did. I didn't see every comment about that particular column because some of them were tangential to other people's posts about it, but I saw a lot, and I suspected as that week developed that it would develop exactly as it did. I thought Scott would listen because I knew he would have a connection with Mitch Barnhart. I knew they would have an affinity for each other. He listened. Baylor stepped forward, made sure he understood how valued he was, and he stayed. The others weren't even really, that never even really got to the batter's box. And ultimately, by the end of that week, they had realized that they could drag it out if they wanted and call every coach who ever, won an NBA playoff game or whatever. But that Mark was probably going to be the best coach that they could get. He was going to be somebody they could sell as an alum with an affinity for the program and a vision for the sport of the future. And it worked out because they got a very talented coach who has a love for the program, and the fans responded. So obviously they're not going to respond as well if it doesn't go, but that risk exists with every new hire. You never know whether that new hire is going to be a smash or not.
Mike, it's always good to talk to you. Hope you get all those boxes unpacked pretty soon in your new home in Pittsburgh.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it very much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks. Make sure to check out Mike's work over at the Sporting News. Follow him on X at TSN Mike. And thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. We'll be back next week with another episode. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcast. Leave us a rating on Spotify. And we'll talk to you again next week. Thanks for listening, everybody.